Let's go for a walk. My next guest is Erik Brynjolfsson. Erik is an economist and professor at Stanford University, where he directs the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. His research focuses on the impact of technology on the economy, productivity, and society. He's written several books, including co-authoring The Second Machine Age with Andy McAfee. He created and was the former director of the MIT Center for Digital Business while he was a professor there. He's a great friend and likely the most intelligent person I've ever met. Without further ado, let's go for a walk with Erik Brynjolfsson. Erik, can you tell me about The Second Machine Age?
The Second Machine Age is the book that I wrote with Andy McAfee, and we named it because we saw that we were entering a real transition in the economy and society. The first machine age was triggered by the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the steam engine that enabled us to automate and augment a lot of muscle power, a lot of physical work. The second machine age is when machines are doing the same thing for our brains and for mental work. And ultimately, I think it's going to be as big or bigger than what happened in the first machine age. First machine age triggered a tremendous amount of growth. We're 30 to 50 times richer than our ancestors were a couple hundred years ago. And with the second machine age, we'll see even bigger changes and even more acceleration of economic growth.
Mm-hmm. And would you consider AI part of the second machine age?
Definitely. It's core to it. With the second machine age, AI is really about artificial intelligence, automating thinking. But it started earlier than that with a lot of other computer technologies. You can really think of the second machine age as having two waves. The first was with traditional coding, where we would figure out step by step what we wanted the machine to do, write it down in a painstaking amount of code. I know that you're a good coder, and you have to know exactly what you want the machine to do. Mm-hmm. And if you write it down wrong, it won't work. Right. With the second wave of the second machine age, the machine itself figures out how to solve the problems, and it's called machine learning. And the way it works is you give it lots of examples of inputs and lots of examples of outputs, and it figures out the mapping from the inputs to the outputs, sometimes by putting weights on millions, billions, and now even trillions of artificial neurons, deep neural networks.
When does it become concerning how intelligent the AI gets?
At every step along the way, there are places where the technology can be abused. Going back to, the fire, people burned themselves. We learned how to cook steaks, which was great, but you can also burn yourself. Cars, eventually we figured out how to put seatbelts on them. And AI can and has been abused. You can use it for cyber phishing attacks or deep fakes. There's a lot of abuses. I am worried that there could be even more serious problems with AI. I mean, when technologies become more powerful, like AI is becoming more and more powerful, that means it can do more good things, but also it can do potentially more dangerous things. So I think we need to keep our eyes on some of the dangers as well as the benefits. And some of those dangers are not just in say, deep fakes and what's happening to democracy and security, but to jobs and the economy, and also to national security and, literally killing people.
Right. Do you fear an AI arms race?
Well, there's different kind of interpretations of that. There's an arms race in the metaphorical sense of Google and OpenAI and lots of other companies competing to create better and better chatbots, large language models, and many other tools. And in a way, that's a healthy thing that, we want competition to spur companies to create better and better tools and hopefully find better ways of helping consumers and the rest of us. But there's also a literal arms race. China, United States, they're competing economically, but they're also increasingly competing militarily. And some in the military call AI the third offset, which is a way of compensating for superior numbers that the enemy may have by having better technology. And both parties are looking to use AI to get an advantage on that side. And that can become destabilizing if one party feels like they have a massive advantage, and they want to try to exploit that.
And is there a way to prevent AI from getting too powerful?
I'm not sure. Do you want to try and walk here?
Let's do that.
Okay. We're walking riskily here on this little narrow part because there's puddles on the ground. So maybe this is kind of a metaphor, right? We'll be careful not to take a false step. There's a risk that AI could become too powerful. I think a lot of people kind of scoff at the idea that AI could become so powerful that we don't control it anymore. It sounds like science fiction. But I don't think it's an outrageous concern. I hope we're able to maintain control of AI. But the truth is that if AI becomes massively more intelligent than us, which it increasingly will be. I mean, in some ways, obviously my calculator is much more intelligent than me when it comes to doing certain kinds of arithmetic. And there are more and more domains where AI can solve problems that I can't solve. AI systems, if you ask them to figure out the vulnerabilities of a nuclear plant or how to hack into it, AI is getting better and better at figuring out vulnerabilities that no human would have come up with, or how to design a virus that has certain properties. Maybe you want it to be as lethal as smallpox and as contagious as the common cold. I wouldn't know how to do that, but AI could consider lots of possibilities and possibly come up with some answers to that question. So those are some dangers that we need to be aware of. I don't think we quite know what this alien intelligence is going to be like. Already with the really big, large language models, the smartest people who are working with the technology don't fully understand it. It's got sometimes trillions of parameters that are hard to interpret, and there's emergent behavior where it does something unexpected. They didn't expect GPT to be able to do coding and know how to write Python, and it turns out that unexpectedly it's pretty good at it, or translate different kinds of languages, or have other kinds of capabilities that people are discovering. So something we should keep an eye on.
Do you think there should be policies in place to regulate AI, or do you think the responsibility more falls on the companies?
Well, there'll definitely need to be policies in place to regulate it. The hard thing is what those regulations should be. I mean, every technology is regulated. I think, jet travel is regulated. Cars are regulated. Buildings and, fire exits are regulated. And they should be, because there's ways that they can be abused. And I've talked to many of the leaders of the companies, and they generally welcome some level of regulation. They don't want to be stuck, as you mentioned earlier, in some kind of an arms race where it's a race to the bottom, and people who aren't taking safety measures end up, creating shortcuts that get them to market a little more quickly, but less safely. And then the companies that are responsible end up falling behind in the marketplace. They would prefer a level playing field where everyone had to adhere to certain standards. Now, the really hard thing is knowing how to regulate, and it's quite possible that regulations could do more harm than good. The EU has passed some AI regulation, the European Union, that was really written and designed before generative AI, before large language models came on the scene. And now they're trying to retrofit it for this new technology. And I think that's symptomatic of what happens when governments regulate. They're almost inevitably a little behind the curve. It's hard to anticipate, hard for anyone to anticipate what the technology will be. So we're in a quandary. I can say I spent some time in Washington, and people in the White House, people in the Senate, people in the agencies are taking it very seriously. They're spending a lot of time trying to understand better what they should be learning and what the trade-offs are. And I know they're doing their best to try to get it right, but it's just not an easy question.
What will the reorganized economy look like when we finish our transition through the second machine age?
Well, that's the $1 trillion question. I don't think anyone knows for sure what it'll look like, except to say that it's going to be different. Historically, I've studied the evolution of technologies, and there's some patterns that emerge. So with the introduction of the steam engine, electricity, these are also very powerful general purpose technologies. Economists talk about general purpose technologies that are pervasive, that affect most of the economy, that rapidly improve, and that thirdly spawn complementary innovations. They trigger add-on innovations like electricity, spawned the light bulb and electric motors and refrigeration and lots of other technologies. These general purpose technologies, it turns out, even though, or maybe because they're so powerful, they take a while to have their full effect. Right. And the reason is that to get the full effect, you need to reorganize work. So in the case of electricity, when they first introduced it into factories, there was very little productivity gain, surprisingly, according to careful records by Paul David and others. It took about 20, 30 years or more before we started seeing some big productivity gains. What happened during that period is people realized that you need to reorganize factories, have a new kind of factory to take advantage of it. The old factory clustered around a steam engine or a water wheel, had all the machinery clustered in tightly based on how much power it needed. The new factories, which again took like a generation, 20 or 30 years to figure out how to do, were spread out sometimes over several acres, where each piece of equipment had its own separate electric motor, sometimes very small electric motors, and the layout was based on the flow of materials. This new layout was dramatically more productive, doubling, tripling productivity. But it wasn't the electricity by itself that did it. It was the combination of the electricity and this reorganization of work. So applying that to the latest wave of technologies, AI, I suspect we're going to have to invent new ways of working as well. It took a while to figure out the best way to take advantage of electricity. We're still working on factory redesign to some extent. Mm-hmm. And people are tinkering with new AI-enabled business models like ChatGPT and business models that they don't even know how to monetize some of the things. And as they try to figure that out better, we'll see a new organization of work that requires new sets of skills, requires less of other sets of skills, and we'll have to be flexible to adapt to that.
And what steps could businesses and workers take to adapt to the shift?
Well, the first thing to do is not to try to hold it back. America, no country has ever succeeded by trying to freeze in place a particular way of working and hang on to the coal mining or whatever kinds of jobs. You have to lean in and embrace the changes. And if you do that, that means you're going to need new skills, and you're going to have people move from one job to another, move from one physical location to another. So it's really an attitude of dynamism and flexibility. That's sort of an attitudinal change, but it also requires investments in education and retraining. It requires government support that allows for more flexibility as people move, maybe not locking benefits into a job, allowing them to be portable with people, finding ways to make it easier for people to physically move to where new jobs and industries are being created. And that's all those things. If they happen, it'll create the kind of flexible economy that makes it easier for us to adjust. No doubt there's going to be jobs that are destroyed and other jobs that are created. And ultimately, I believe it's less risky to embrace that dynamism than to try to freeze things into any particular way of doing business.
Mm-hmm. And for those in less skilled jobs, how can they race with the machine rather than against it?
Yeah, race with the machine versus race against it is an idea that Andy McAfee and I coined with one of our early books. And the idea is that you can try to compete with the machine, let the machine do the job, and then you try to stop it, or you can try to use the machine to leverage what you're doing and be a complement, not a substitute.
Right.
Complements mean that two things are more valuable together. Substitutes mean that it's either one or the other. And I think people need to be doing exactly that with AI in particular. It's too common to think of a task and look at it and say, okay, how can AI replace that task? Right. And really what you should be doing is thinking, how can AI augment that task? Well, let me give you a concrete example. Well, along with Lindsay Raymond and Daniel Lee, we studied the introduction of AI into a set of call centers and contact centers. And what we found was that the AI was most effective when it was helping the call center workers answer questions as opposed to having the customer talk directly to the AI. The AI was very good at certain kinds of questions, the more common kinds of questions. It was not very good at unusual one-off questions where it had no training data, but humans could do those pretty well. So the human and machine together could cover the space of most of the questions very effectively. And the AI would give hints to the humans for those more common questions about good answers, things that had worked well in the past. And the people who used the AI were up to 35% more productive than the people who weren't getting help from the AI. And they got up to speed a lot faster. Within 2 months, they were performing as well as people who hadn't used the AI had been performing after 6 months. Customer satisfaction went up. Customer sentiment went up. We've looked at the millions of transcripts like we did. We found a lot more happy words and fewer angry words in those transcripts. Right. And even the employees seemed to like it better. It wasn't like they were being squeezed. There was less employee turnover as well, because I guess they like talking to happy customers and having help. So that new system where AI was a complement rather than a substitute turned out to be very effective. The company's been incredibly successful. And I think it's a harbinger of a approach that works very well, which is having the AI designed to support human workers rather than replace them. And let me just be clear. I'm not saying that everywhere, every place, every time that's the best strategy, but more often than not, companies would be better off looking for opportunities like that.
And what jobs do you think are going to be replaced first by AI?
Yeah, that's a really tough question because, to be frank, in Second Machine Age, the book, we had sort of a vision of the kinds of jobs that machines could do better, ones that had a lot of routine, repetitive work, a lot of structured tasks. And certainly those are ones where often AI can work well. And we thought more creative work that required more emotional intelligence would be more difficult. Yeah. As it turns out now, that was true, I think, for much of the 2010s. But the past couple of years, we're beginning to see AI systems that are surprisingly, I guess I call them creative. Maybe not like coming up with entirely new novels, but variations on a song or variations on a story or a way of answering a call center question that makes the customer happier. Right. So they are beginning to show sparks of creativity, and they're also beginning to show sparks of emotional intelligence. In those transcripts, one of the things we saw was that the AI would often suggest more empathetic responses than the human may have come up with on their own. So ironically, the AI was actually very good at emotional intelligence. So the scope of things that humans can do better than AI seems to be shrinking. And I'm right now struggling to be confident of any task. I mean, one category that for now still seems to be humans have an advantage, ironically, is physical tasks. Things like buttoning a shirt or picking up a dime off of a table or walking upstairs. These are things that robots have a lot of trouble with. And most 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds can do these tasks. So it's something that humans are still very good at, but I've seen demos in the lab where robots are getting better and better at that. And I still put really big creativity, large scale problem solving. And ultimately, I think asking the right questions is the comparative advantage of humans, pointing the AI in the right direction. There are people who do prompt engineering that basically ask the AI how to, what problems to solve. And so it's on us to direct the AI in directions we want it to go. And for now, at least, those are some areas where humans have a comparative advantage. Mm-hmm. But it's an interesting question.
So given the advances in general AI and programming, would you recommend that today someone study computer science?
I would, but the kind of computer science is evolving towards more high-level coding. I mean, we've seen this all through the history of computer science. It used to people wrote in machine code assembler and low-level coding languages, and it's going higher and higher. And now some of the best coders are writing essentially in English. But you still have to, as I said, know what the problem is that you want to solve and direct it in the right direction, and have a kind of a mindset that is a problem solver's or engineer's mindset. But the way that you actually operationalize that is getting to be more and more high level. I would still call that kind of coding, but the language that you're working with is different. I think, so it's evolving a bit, but some of the principles about understanding what the user requirements are and what your capabilities of the technology are still going to be important. But the way it gets translated is changing.
Why does big data drive change?
Well, I think the AI revolution has really been driven in part by this explosion of digital data. So this video is digital, and I'm old enough to remember when photographs were mostly made out of chemicals and they cost about 50 cents to make one photo. Now there are billions or trillions of photos that are taken all the time, digital video, digital audio. Our communications, people rarely handwrite letters anymore. Now those are also digital. So there's been an explosion of digital data, and that's the lifeblood of training these systems. One of the reasons AI has taken off is we just have a lot more digital data. Our phones are constantly recording so much information, more than most people realize. And that's like a stream of digital breadcrumbs that track what we're doing. And much of this digital data can be used to train algorithms for whether it's face recognition or spam recognition or recommendations of books. It's not just the digital data, though. It's also very powerful computers that are able to crunch through those. If you wanted to take all this digital data and run it on a 1980s or 1990s or early 2000s vintage computer, it just wouldn't be possible. There's just too much computation. But modern computers can do that. And last but not least, there have been significant improvements in the algorithms. Some breakthroughs in how we do machine learning. For instance, the transformer architecture is really what underlies large language models and the reason that they're so effective. You put those three things together, and you get the kind of breakthroughs we've been seeing.
And how do you think companies can use big data to make educated decisions?
Well, there's a class of problems that are more suitable for big data and some that are less suitable. And I have a company called WorkHelix that basically analyzes all the tasks in their companies, tens of thousands of distinct different kinds of tasks, and scores every one of them as to whether or not big data can help with that particular task. So if you apply this rubric to the tasks in the company, you're able to get a sense of priorities. But in general, there are ones where you have well-defined inputs and well-defined outputs. In most companies, there are numerous tasks that fit these categories. And so there's kind of a gold rush going on right now to implement machine learning and other data-driven techniques to have technology help with those tasks. And the companies that do that best and that do it first are getting a competitive advantage. So we're seeing, if you look at the data, leading firms are pulling away from the median or the laggard firm. There's gotten to be a bigger and bigger split in profitability among American firms and among European and Asian firms. And as those gaps are growing, because these leading firms are embracing the technology faster than their competitors.
Right. Is data the most valuable asset in the second machine age?
Certainly a valuable asset. I guess you could say yes. I mean, people talk about data being the new oil or other metaphors. You need probably people are the most valuable asset, people who understand how to use the technology, and companies that have the right people are able to use data and their other resources. But ultimately, it's a combination of human capital, smart people with data, and sometimes you need access to computer technology and other technologies, although largely those are purchasable, with the exception of a few, NVIDIA chips. There's a market for most of the technology that people need, and you can get those. So
Right.
ultimately, the people and the data are more defensible.
Switching gears a little bit over to economics, is GDP a flawed measurement for measuring economic activity?
Well, it's good for what it was originally designed for, but people are using it for a lot of things that they shouldn't be using it for. GDP is a measure of production, but people use it as a measure of welfare or well-being, and it's not good for that. It's not telling us how well off we are. But and the person who basically designed it, Simon Kuznets, back in the 1930s, said don't use it for that purpose. But it's kind of the only game in town. I mean, the problem is that there are a lot of things that cost very little to produce, zero. I don't know if you're charging anything for this podcast, but there's a lot of digital goods that are zero price that create tremendous value. And GDP, with few exceptions, if something has zero price, it counts zero weight in GDP. So we completely miss a lot of digital goods, Wikipedia, and a lot of what's happening with online digital goods. On the other hand, the value for them is huge. I mean, the average American spends actually a majority of their waking hours consuming digital goods or screens, whether it's on their computer, on their phone, on their television. They're looking at screens more than half their waking hours.
Right.
So that, voting with their eyeballs, I guess, voting with their time suggests that they get a lot of value from it. They care a lot about it, but it's not showing up in GDP commensurately. So we're trying to develop a new set of metrics. We call it GDP-B, where the B stands for the benefits, not the costs. It's not what you pay for, it's how much value you get from it.
Right.
That does a better job of capturing the value from not just digital goods, but all goods and services.
Right. And could you talk about how the well-being gains from digital goods, not captured by conventional GDP or productivity measures, are impacting our understanding of economic progress in the digital age?
Sure. So we didn't consume a lot of digital goods, 10, 20, 30 years ago, but we're spending more and more of our time consuming them. And since we're not being measured in GDP, that means we're missing out on a big part of the growth and welfare and well-being in the economy.
Right.
And that's part of the explanation for why measured productivity growth hasn't been as high as people expected. It's that we're literally not measuring where the value is being created. But by measuring GDP-B, we put a value on those digital goods. So Wikipedia, by our estimates, is worth about $150 per year of utility to the average person or the median person. Some people more, some people less. And likewise, digital photographs, Google search, email, music, social media. As we put value on them, we see that the true measure of welfare has been growing, and that means the productivity is higher than we estimated, and it gives a new perspective on economic growth. Going forward, I think it's going to be increasingly important to not only continue to have GDP, just to know where we're spending the money, but also have more emphasis on GDP-B, our new metric,
right,
so that we know how well we're actually doing.
And could you explain a little bit more about how GDP-B works compared
Sure.
to GDP?
So the idea is it's trying to capture an economic concept called consumer surplus.
Mhm.
That is, consumer surplus is how much you'd be willing to pay for something if you had to versus how much you actually pay.
Right.
And that difference is the consumer surplus you get from it. So if something costs zero and you get, say, $150 of value from it, that's your consumer surplus from the average person from Wikipedia.
Mhm.
But you get consumer surplus from pretty much everything you buy. If you buy a pair of shoes and you paid $100, but you would have been willing, if you had to pay up to $130, then you're getting $30 of consumer surplus from those shoes.
Right.
And so everything that you voluntarily purchase, you're getting somewhere from zero to some large positive number of consumer surplus from them.
Right.
If you add up all those amounts for each person, conceptually, that's the consumer surplus. Now, that's the concept. In terms of how you actually estimate it, what we do is a massive number of online choice experiments where we basically offer people combinations. For instance, we'll say, hey, we'll give you $10 to be locked out of Facebook for a month. Will you take it? And some people say yes, and some people say no. Then we offer other people $15, some people $2, some people $30.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately you get a whole demand curve of how much you have to pay on average for different people to have them give up the good. And you do that with lots of different goods. Sometimes we just do it hypothetically and we say, okay, which would you rather give up, Facebook or Snapchat, and other times we actually pay them. And if you do this enough times, like hundreds of thousands or millions of times with different people and different goods, you start getting a picture of how much value there is in the economy from these different goods. So that's what we're doing right now. And over the coming year, we'll be rolling out a parallel set of metrics alongside official GDP that the Bureau of Economic Analysis produces. We'll have our GDP-B numbers so people can compare where the money's spent versus where the value is coming. Another way is looking at how much time people spend on it. Whenever people consume a digital good, they're really paying in two different ways. They may be paying with money, which is what we think of, but they're also paying with their time. Each of us, sadly, is only endowed with a finite amount of time on Earth, 24 hours a day, and some number of years. We don't know exactly how many it is for most people. And if you spend one of those hours watching a YouTube video or scanning social media or reading, blogs, that is an hour you weren't spending doing something else. Maybe you weren't spending it earning money to buy ice cream or, doing some other kind of consumption.
Right.
The way that people allocate their time is basically them voting with a really precious currency, time. You pay attention and you literally are paying. So from this, we can back out how valuable different goods are by what people are willing to pay for them in terms of their time cost.
Nice.
And so we're also doing that in parallel and come up also, as you can imagine, with some really big numbers in terms of what people are willing to forego in order to consume some of these digital goods.
So if Jeff Bezos watches a YouTube video, is that at $500 million of value?
No, that's true. One thing that's, this is a quirk, I guess you could call it, of capitalism, is that it does put more value, whether it's by dollars or by time, on people who are have a higher time cost. Like,
right.
To be a little subtle about it, you really have to look at what their opportunity cost, like what he could have been doing with that time. If you happen to be rich, doesn't necessarily mean your time is more valuable. If you're just like, we're born with a lot of money. But if you have a high opportunity cost, if Bezos could have been doing something else that would have earned him $1 million during that hour, then that is an opportunity cost. So you want to look at, to be precise about it, what you're giving up by spending the time there. And, in terms of just dollar values, that is going to be different for different people.
What was it like to meet President Obama?
Oh, that was fun. Yeah. So I got to invite to the White House a few times and had lunch with him one time, dinner with him one time. And I was like blown away. Actually, when I first met him, it was kind of caught me off guard. I was talking to some people in the White House, Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz and some other folks. We'd all been invited for this lunch. There were like 6 of us. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there talking to Paul Krugman and feel this hand on my shoulder and turn around and there's like Barack Obama. And he's like, he says, "Erik, good to see you." And I'm like, I kind of was a little breathless. For some reason, I just sort of momentarily forgot I was in the White House, and then suddenly brought me back to reality. And he had been prepped well, or had actually read my book or whatever, and started asking me some questions about the book, which was kind of fun. And then we all had lunch, and he was like intensely well read and up to speed on things. I mean, one particular little funny anecdote was he asked each of us about some policy recommendation that we had for him. So everybody went around, and Paul Krugman gave him some suggestions about infrastructure spending. I don't remember the details, but he explained it a little bit with some data about why we should do more infrastructure spending. And Barack kind of listened to him for a bit. And then he said back to him this new set of statistics that were like updated, but like 1 quarter more recent, and like was like one-upping Paul Krugman. And I just remember thinking, like, this is amazing. Paul Krugman's a Nobel Prize winner, gets to pick any topic he wants to talk about. And Barack Obama is matching him, or even seemingly having even more data on that topic. So we ended up talking for like 2.5 hours at lunch. Obama said that he had to have some meeting on Capitol Hill but he said he'd rather just come and talk with us for a bit, so he was late to his other
Oh
meeting.
my God. That's an amazing story. Wow. Paul Krugman probably walked out at lunch like, I got to read some more scientific papers.
I know, get up to speed, Paul. Come on.
Yeah. 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 And with that was it. Thank you very much for coming on.
You.
That was a great interview.
Okay. That was fun. Yeah, no, that was